what you're going to do is you're going to pay attention in your environment, and you're going to look for someone that needs you. Someone struggling, someone who's stressed. Pick a person that you have a lot of contact with, and then you're going to make a gift of yourself to that person. You're going to do something that shows that you see them. You see them in their suffering, in their stress, in their whatever. And then they have to do something that makes a gift of themselves. So for young people, it might look like mission trip, right? It might look like being a surgeon, and you just live your vocation and all your lay responsibilities with the intention of being holy. That's what it looks like. I don't look at myself. I don't take for myself, which we're going to see in a second, in the fall, but I'm giving myself for the other. And a life lived that way is a life of self-sacrifice. And that's what love is. Because we know Jesus did it unto death. That's what it means to love, right? That's what original nakedness is about. Now, the man and the woman, they know all this because of an experience, an interior experience we call original innocence. Today, in our time, in our church, we call it sanctifying grace. So if anybody ever asks you, did Adam and Eve have sanctifying grace? The answer is yes, they did, right? Original innocence, okay. Imagine polar bears. This is fun. I know it seems totally random. It's going to make sense. What kind of environment would a polar bear best flourish in? Cold, right? This is where they can be the best kind of polar bear, right, that they were created to be, in the cold, right? Innocence is an environment, but it's interior. It's an interior way of being that allowed Adam and Eve, the first parents, to have all of these experiences. It was because of their innocence. That is what was the interior environment where all of this is happening. Original innocence is their holiness, their closeness to God. That's give and receive love, right? John Paul calls it the spousal meaning of the body. And no matter if you're married or not, your body is still spousal. That's how you're created. And we're going to see why when we get to the end of the story. How do we get this, right? We got to say a little bit about how we get this, how we maintain this innocence, or this. Now that we're fallen, we can't, right? We can't have this state and return to it, but John Paul says what we can do is we can work against our now fallen state to try and redirect ourselves back to God as our highest, inclination. And this is the spiritual life. Living out the virtues, having a relationship, right, with Jesus, receiving the sacraments. That is how I can turn this ship back on course, right? Just wanted to mention that with innocence. Okay, second part. So that's our past, right? So now we're going to talk about our present. Okay, so whenever we talk about our present, remember, it's every person who lives in time after the fall. Okay, and so John Paul does a number of things here. He asked the question, if they were really free of any interior obstacles to being holy, so no temptation, right? How did what would have made Adam and Eve fall? Was it really eating an apple? Was that, I don't know, okay? But the point is, what was it? Because they didn't have temptation like we have temptation, right? They weren't fallen. They weren't inclined to sin like we are now, right? They were inclined to always give themselves to God. So what is it? What happened? And that's the first step he takes. He says, he examines the fall in Genesis 3, and he says, okay, what's happening here, right, is the serpent comes in, and what does he say to Eve? Huh? Before that, he asked her a question. Did God really say you can't eat from any of these trees? And Eve, she knows the rules, right? No, he didn't say that. He said you could eat from any tree, right? She explains it, right? Now, think about something maybe that you've turned in at work, or maybe for your ministry, whatever that is, and you give it to whoever, you have to give it to, and they say, are you sure you did that? Are you sure you? Tell me what your experience is in your mind. You doubt yourself. Even if you double, triple checked it, had it proofread, right? When someone questions and says, did you really? The natural thing that happens in our minds is you go, wait, did I? And me, even if I know I'm sure, I will hand it over, but I will still go back and make sure. Right? That's what we do. John Paul says this is what the serpent did. He introduced doubt. He introduced doubt. Did God really say that? And she's like, yeah, he's that. But now she's like, wait, did he really say that? Right? And so we're seeing that experience in Eve, right? And by the way, the story says, and then she turned to her husband and gave him the fruit. Okay, so I just want to say he was there, okay? Eve kind of gets the blame for this all the time, right? But he was right there, okay? They were together in this, right? Okay, so and what's going on here, the serpent then, once she's doubting, right? She's like, wait, did he really? And then he goes the next step. Well, if you eat it, you're going to be like gods. Small g, right? Gods. And you'll know right from wrong. And so once the doubt is planted there, right? Eve is like, yeah, I want to decide for myself what is right or wrong. It wasn't, because here's the thing, they were already like God. They're the only creature made in his image. They were already like God. But it's not that they wanted to be like God. They wanted to be their own gods and decide for themselves what's right or wrong. I'm not hurting anybody as long as it makes me happy. What's your problem with it? I wouldn't do it, but I mean, I don't think it shouldn't be, should we go away in the law? I would never do that, but someone else might. Right? I want to decide. I want to decide for myself what's right or wrong, okay? And John Paul says the effect on them is immediate. Their interior world or environment changes, right? And their experience goes immediately from what they're experiencing in all their original experiences, automatically then they are, and all at once, they are now experiencing a new interior environment. And we call that environment concupiscence. And we have to know what that word means. Have y'all heard that word before? I go speak at groups and they've never heard it. So, okay, good. Concupiscence is a word that simply means intense human emotion, right? And we use it in theology to be able to describe the fallen, intense human emotions we all experience because of it, right? And I think the easiest way, right, to see the definition is a little visual. Remember our original man right here? All nice and pretty and right, and directed to God, perfectly ordered to God. That's our human, right? That's our first environment. Okay, well, this is what the new environment looks like, right? So notice those lines coming down from the rational, right, to order all the lower inclinations. John Paul says, we are shattered. That's a word he uses. Shattered, right? And as a result, these lower inclinations, they are not happily surrendering anymore. Now these lower inclinations, they are working against our reason. And C.S. Lewis, again, in The Problem of Pain, he has this phrase that was so, he has this way of being able to paint the picture and help you really imagine it, And he says, this was a creature in the fall, it was a creature that God never intended to exist. That mankind sinned itself into a new species that God never intended. We sinned ourselves into what we are now. Well, that's Lewis. But I'm saying, it paints a very vivid picture, doesn't it? Of what the fall did. John Paul uses the word shattered. And he said the reason now it's like this, our experience, right, this new interior environment, is, of course, because of their sin, of course, right? But he says now they lost original innocence, right? And all that's left is the death of sin. Not to mention, all of those preternatural gifts are shattered. All of them are shattered, right? So now the body will die. The soul, now think of it. The soul is, if I have a living organism and the soul is what's making it alive, right? The soul is permeated throughout my whole organism, right? Every part of me that's alive, right? Because the soul is my person, right? What happens if somebody cuts off their hand? What happens to the hand? The hand dies because it's not connected to the body anymore, right? That's what sin does. That's what they did. They're not connected to God anymore. They now don't have sin. And why do we inherit it? Why is it, I didn't do anything. They did it, right? So why do we inherit it? Why is it an inherited sin? Because we send ourselves into a new species. And Lewis says, what could have possibly caused them to do that? They committed a mortal sin, one mortal sin, and they changed all of creation for all of time. What could it have been? And he said, we don't know what it is, but it had to be heinous because they had no obstacle to choosing God. And so Lewis says the only thing that they had that could stand apart from God and submitting to his will was themselves. They chose themselves over God. They chose themselves. And now, our interior environment is no longer that the whole person is directed to our highest inclinations, which ultimately is union with God, right? Where we now, by our nature, our fallen nature, where we're directed, is to ourselves. I don't want to give now. I want to see what I can get now. Have y'all heard the me generation? You see, all that's symptomatic, right? It's all about me. You know, it's all supposed to be about God. It's not all supposed to be about me. But now, this new environment, that's what it's about. Okay, so let's see the effect on the relationship between the man and the woman. Adam, Eve, with your glasses, your gift, your signs, come. Okay, put on those glasses. All right. Okay, so original relationship, right? Go ahead, show us. Keep going. Original relationship. Okay, now we have the sin, and now we have the new interior environment. The first thing, they're not seeing each other with God's vision anymore. They gave up that grace, right? Now, Adam and Eve, I would like you to, Adam, you hold the gift, and turn around. Don't stand back to back. Stand a little bit, you two, turn around. Okay, now Adam, give yourself to Eve. No, I'm serious, try it. Go ahead. You can't look at each other. Yeah, it's rough, huh? Okay, go ahead, try.
Give it back there?
Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
Oh, they're really good at it. Okay, I'm so glad that happened. Great job. You see, the gift, the self-gift, right? We can still do it, but it ain't easy. It's not going to be easy because that's our new environment, right? Okay, excellent. You may return to your seats. Good job. Okay. Yes, clap for them. That's awesome. Okay. All right, so John Paul says, how does this affect the body, right? Remember when we imagined just the human soul? Yeah, now our tendency is to think of ourselves as a body and a soul separate. It's like kind of our first go-to when we talk about the person. Instead of I'm an embodied soul, and that's my person, right? He says we now in our consciousness experience a separation within ourselves. And the Catechism quotes St. Paul, where he says, now there's a war within me. The flesh versus the spirit, right? That's why Paul says that. That's our new experience. So these higher inclinations, the rational inclination, no longer has dominion, or the same kind of dominion. It's supposed to, right? That's what now we got to work to. But what's beautiful about God is that when he comes in the picture, oh yeah, I already talked about losing the gifts, I think. Okay. All right, well, first let me also say this. He says, the experience that the body goes from, a full understanding of what the body means, not only that I'm giving myself as a gift and received as a gift, but that I was made for love and to love. That's what my body would reveal to me. He says, now our experience of our own bodies is doubt. We don't know why we have them. We're unsure of the connection between our bodies and ourselves, our bodies in God, our bodies in each other. Right now there's doubt. Okay, we talked about reciprocal shame. Okay, this is gonna have to be skipped. Okay, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll do it, because it's really good. Okay, so John Paul, I imagine this like this. John Paul says, what arises in the experience of the man, the woman, is an insurmountable threshold in their being able to communicate themselves to one another. And he says, not only just talking communication, but in the language of the body, right? Giving myself, receiving the other, right? That there's an insurmountable threshold now. So I imagine it like this. I'm on this cliff, and there's another cliff across an ocean, and that's where my husband is, right? In our consciousness now of our experience, the union is challenged. So if you ever had a conversation with someone of the opposite sex, whether it's your spouse or a coworker, and you're trying to explain something, and then you walk away, and you're just like, yeah, he has no idea what I'm saying. Right? Right? Yeah, it happens all the time. My husband and I have actually had shouting matches, and we're saying the same thing, and then we realize, and we're like, wait, we agree. Okay. Right? That's how, so you see, that's just one symptom, right, of now the way that they can have communion, how it is this insurmountable threshold. He's not going to be able to know my experience in that, right? We are foreign to each other almost, right? Okay, yeah, that's good. And John Paul, though, he points out it's limited now, but it's not impossible, right? It's limited, but not impossible. Oh, I did something bad, hang on. Okay, all right, so now instead of union, their experience of each other is opposition. Opposition. Now, when Adam and Eve look at each other, what is the first thing they do after the fall? Hide. And then they make some clothes, right? They hide from God and from each other. You ever mess up really bad and you don't go to confession right away because you're like, that's really bad, I can't. We hide from God now when we sin. That's our first tendency, not to run to him with our sin, but to hide for a little while, right? Because we're shamed. And then with each other, they cover up, what do they cover up? Their masculinity and femininity is what they cover up. The very things created to image God in the world, they hide in shame, right? But there's this one verse in the fall story, Genesis 3:21, and it's like all this drama is happening. God's doling out the consequences, right? He's saying, okay, Eve, childbirth, you're going to be suffering. Adam, you're going to suffer because you can't get food the right way. He's just doling it out, serpent on the ground. Okay, the serpent was on the ground. He was like, you got to crawl on your belly. Did he have legs? Okay, anyway, it doesn't matter. That's a whole other story. Did the serpent have legs? I mean, because now he's crawling on the belly. Okay, that's really fun to think about. Okay, so what happens, right? There's this one verse. And it says, the Lord God made for the man and his wife garments of skin with which he clothed them. He made them better clothes. And then the very next verse, and they cast them from the garden. Get out. Here's your better clothes, right? Well, in this moment, right, when God enters into their shame, right, John Paul says there's a double effect. God takes their shame, concupiscence, and because he enters into it, he turns it into an opportunity for grace. Because, of course, the negative effect of the concupiscence is now when I look at Adam and he looks at me, we want to use each other. That's our inclination now, to use one another. Not to give or receive the other as gift, but to use one another. So now they got to protect themselves from that, so they cover up, right? That's the negative. But because God enters into that experience and he makes it possible, he puts them in better clothes, right? He makes it possible that the shame they have could protect them. In this new environment now, be properly covered up. And then that will demand the other treat you as gift. Right? He turns what is fallen in us into grace. And that's the whole point, because it should be something familiar for the next part of this, right? Because then we have the entrance of Jesus into time, right? And John Paul says in the incarnation, I didn't draw that, by the way. I got that from TOB Institute. But he enters into our shame. He takes on our flesh. He literally takes us on, right? And because he does that, everything in me, because he was fully human, right? He had a fully human nature. Everything in me is possible to be redeemed. And so John Paul says, what Jesus does in the incarnation, the Paschal mystery, he ushers in to time, here, now, that we are fallen, but we don't have to live that way. And he calls this the ethos of the redemption of the body. The ethos of the redemption of the body. And ethos is the way that we perceive things in our culture, like moral norms, right? So in our culture, the moral norms are very different from the Catholic norms, right? And John Paul says what we have to do in the redemption, if we're going to live redeemed, what we have to do as Catholics is in the world where the culture's not living redeemed, we are the lights. We're the ones that are supposed to show that even though we're fallen, we don't have to act that way. Like, that's our job now, right? And he calls that the ethos of redemption of the body, right? How are we going to do it? I'm glad you asked. All right, so, whoa, too far. God, Jesus, hang on, I need a new character. I'm going to go way back. Chad, come see Chad. Okay. We're going to come back here. Okay, Chad. You just stand here until I tell you to come forward, okay? All right. Okay, so God became human in the person of Christ, right? All right. Oh, where did Jesus go after the ascension? Where is his glorified, resurrected body? It's in heaven. He ascended into heaven, correct? Okay. So we didn't live in the time Jesus was on earth, right? So how are we going to get the grace, right? In every sacrament, the sacraments are a visible sign of an invisible reality that make something happen. They are called efficacious signs. Okay, so let's imagine we're driving along and there's a stop sign. It's a sign, right? What do we do with stop signs? Does everybody? No. You know why? Because the stop sign is not an efficacious sign. See, if it did what it represents, an arm would come out and like mechanically stop my car. Like, it would do what it says. You see that? That's what a sacrament is. It does what it says. Okay, so baptism, Eucharist, confession, whatever it is. God, who is outside of time, in eternity, right, in his glorified, resurrected body, with, as Revelation shows us, the book of Revelation, whenever John sees a vision of what's going on up there, a lamb as if slain on an altar, and the people in white robes all around the altar worshiping, incense going up. Okay, they're having basically mass. Okay, all right. Okay, so that's going on, right? Everything God does in time, when God came into time, did he leave eternity? No, we're still here. So we know that he stayed, right? Because we're still existing. Okay, all right. Now, Jesus in his resurrected body is outside of time. And now we have a sacrament, right? We bring our baby to the church, baptism, right? What is invisible is that God, in the person, come on, Jesus, come on into time, right? What? Everything, right? Jesus, every time we have a sacrament, literally, God is coming, opening the veil, and he comes into time. And through the sacraments, what he did for us in time 2,000 plus years ago is made present again here. And it's applied to us. So in baptism, it's a reestablishment of sanctifying grace. In the Eucharist, it's him, right? Notice the priest does not say, when he says, this is my body, we do not think we're going up there to take a chunk out of the priest's body, right? We know we're receiving Jesus, his whole person, in the Eucharist, right? It's possible because what God did in time, eternity, how much time is there? None. Well, there's some debate. But anyway, the point is, it's not like time here. Okay, it's not like time here. God lives outside of time, right? But when we have the sacrament, he's here doing what is invisible to us. It's actually happening. Great job, Jesus. Thank you. Keep this. Okay. That's why, right? Baptism gown, right? When we take our babies to the church, we're going to talk about why this is what they look like in a second. Okay. In historical man, right, what happens is God now infuses in us the graces that we need to fight concupiscence. Notice the infusion of faith. Have y'all ever heard the phrase, the light of faith? Have y'all heard that phrase? The light of faith. It's used a lot in the vigil, right? So like all the lights are off. Ever been to the Easter vigil? All the lights are turned off. We have candles, right? The light is coming into the darkness, okay? When the fall happened, we lost that infused knowledge in the preternatural gifts. So imagine we would just make this room very dark, right? Completely dark. Or first, let's imagine it's really bright. We can see really well. All the colors are vivid, right? At the fall, everything went dark in the intellect, right? So the fall darkens the intellect. Well, check it out. We had 3 virtues infused in us in baptism. The first is faith. Guess where that's infused in? The intellect. The light of faith is infused into our intellects that are dark. He's given us what we need. Hope. What did they lose the hope of in the fall? Eternal life. What if they eat from the tree of life? Get them out of here, Lord. Right? It's close to us. No heaven until Jesus died and resurrected, right? Now, what do we have? We can enter heaven. We can. Or we have the hope of it, right? And then finally, charity. Since so many of you have children, what's the role of the umbilical cord? Baby, life, right? If the umbilical cord is messed up, the baby's gonna die, right? When we sinned, that umbilical cord was cut. Charity or love is the infused virtue that reestablishes that relationship from God to receive the fullness of life from God, right? Okay, but look at that mess. Because concupiscence doesn't go away. John Paul says we can never return to original innocence. We can't bring it back. Remember? It was a change in species, as Lewis puts it. Okay, so what does that mean for us? Well, we got to talk about our future. So I have to skip a little bit of this, I'm sorry. We have to talk about our future next, the last part of the triptych. And John Paul says, first of all, what happens at the resurrection? Now, Jesus will return, and all of us will be alive, resurrected, alive again. our bodies and souls reunited, but not like zombie apocalypse. My husband's like, and you wonder why people believe in zombies. That's what he tells me. Anyway, not like zombies, right? Because the body will be glorified, right? Same body, but something very different about it. This is called spiritualization of the body. Okay, so let's think of some examples. We don't have very many examples, right, that we know of. We know of 2 people who have their glorified bodies in heaven, for sure. Who are they? Mary and Jesus, right? Okay, well, we have some evidence that we can look to see what our future is like. Okay, so think about the stories of Jesus after his resurrection, before he ascended into heaven. How is his body different from how ours is now? What were some differences? He could pass through walls. I mean, he'd just like appear. And in Emmaus, remember, he not only appeared, I mean, he's there with them, and then he vanishes. Just vanishes out of thin air, right? So there's something going on there, right? There are several instances where people don't recognize him. Emmaus, Mary Magdalene, right? They don't recognize him. Mary Magdalene thinks he's the gardener. She was one of his women that followed them along the ministry, right? She knew him, but she didn't recognize him, right? But we see that it's an actual material body. Why? Because Thomas, put your hand in my side. Okay, so what is going on, right? We call this spiritualization. John Paul did not invent this, by the way, but he explains it really well. Okay, it's called spiritualization. There is a new system of powers. Our current system of powers is the intellect and the free will. That's our spiritual system of powers that is interacting with our bodies in a broken way, right? But the new system of powers, John Paul says, not only it will not be a return to innocence like an original innocence, it will be an existence that we have never had ever in time, because it will be so perfect. A new system of powers will enable the body to do things and obey the Spirit in ways that aren't even possible here in time. And we have an example of that, by the way. It might take me a while to get to it. Hang on. Check her out. They're all the same person, but you wouldn't know it if you weren't Catholic and you never saw this before. You'd be like, hey, that's a picture of all different people, right? And when she appears in each of these places, what language was she speaking? Theirs. Now, there's 2 theories about Mary's presence. Some people say it's a moral presence, like it's not like an actual, like, tangible presence. But then there's another school of thought that says, well, she has a body, so if she's appearing, maybe it is tangible. Okay. Church doesn't make a decision. It just, right? But we get the point here. Matter of fact, we're more like her, except we're sinners. But we're more like her because she's human. She's not divine. And look how her body obeys the Spirit. Right? Okay. So how is this possible, this spiritualization, right? Oh, and by the way, another way it's going to be different in this perfect new way of being, no more concupiscence, no more death, right? So Adam and Eve, they chose death through their free will, right? Guess what? You can't sin. See, in the beginning, the interior environment we had, because it's our story, right? In the beginning, we were free, but we could choose evil. We were free, right, to choose. And then they messed up and they chose, right? And he says in the second environment, concupiscence, in the absence of a particular and special grace from God, like Mary had, we can't avoid sin. Because it's like what we're inclined to now. That's the second interior, right? Third interior is going to be not only are you free of sin and concupiscence and you won't ever die again, there will be no more sin. It's over. No more sin. No more death ever. No more separation of the body and soul ever. Our bodies and our souls will be in heaven, hopefully, forever, right? And so John Paul says, how is this possible? He says it's possible through where did my chair go? Oh, okay. It's possible through a process that is called divinization. Now, we don't want to confuse this, all right? Other religions believe in divinization. Like when you die, you become a god, okay? That's not what we're talking about here. John Paul says this process of divinization, which he's not making up. This has always been church teaching. Divinization will be a union so profound with God that my new interior environment in the resurrection will be God himself. It will be God himself. So, when the baby's baptized, we come with the water, right? And what do we believe happens with the baby? What's the invisible reality that baptism brings us? Okay, freezes original sin, establishes back in communion with God, right? One day I'm going to have a stand for this. I'm sorry. It's just, we're going to have to, we'll just get the point anyway. Okay, in the resurrection, we say that we come face to face with God. But what does that mean? Now, I have to tell y'all, I just put these quotes, the last page of your notes is just like these quotes, because those are all from John Paul. I didn't write them. Okay, those are all John Paul, because you could literally take one and meditate on it for a while to try and like absorb it. But I wanted to give them to you, and this is why. I was reading this speech, and I've probably read his catechesis 7 or 8 times now, and every time I like get to this part, and I'm like, he cannot be saying what I think he's saying, right? I'm like, that's not what he's saying. And then I read the next paragraph, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that's what he's saying. That's exactly what he's saying. Okay, to understand divinization, right, and that we don't become God as in we become the God, but we're divinized, I'm going to use this example. All right, let's say we're the sponge, okay? And the water is God, okay, for this analogy. What's going to happen when I submerge the sponge in the water? It's going to absorb it, okay? So what we see is the sponge completely submerged in the water. Completely, so I don't want to say surrounded, but like you're completely absorbed into the water here, right? And what's going to happen when I take it out, and if I wring it out? What's going to come out? Water, not sponge. Water. It's also the interior, but you're still a sponge. We do not lose our individuality. John Paul says we don't lose our individual subjectivity. We're still us. But my interior reality, like the sponge, it is God's presence himself. I'm completely absorbed in him, and he's completely filling me, so much so that not just my soul, like in baptism, but even in my body, he is present. And there's this part where John Paul's analyzing, doing an exegesis, where Jesus says, in heaven there is no marriage. When I tell my teenagers that, 17-year-olds, right, about to go to college, like, what? We're not gonna be, what about our husbands in heaven? They get all excited. I'm like, whoa. Just because there's not marriage doesn't mean you're not gonna love your spouse more when you get there. Because you're not gonna be loving them like God. The image is gone. God's gonna be loving them through you. That is a higher kind of love than we can ever achieve here in time, right? And this is what John Paul calls the reason for the spousal meaning of the body. Because when Jesus comes, his bride is going to rise. We're his bride. And there will be a non-sexual, because there's no more marriage, there will be a non-sexual one flesh union with God. And that's why our bodies are spousal. And that's our future. And that's what all this is for, so we can achieve that union in the resurrection. Right? Okay. Are y'all ready to write a lesson? And I call it an embodied or incarnational pedagogy, which just means way of teaching. And what I noticed, what I have learned and noticed is kids are all into experiences these days, aren't they? They don't really want to hear you preach. Reading might be a challenge, right? They want to experience something. Think about virtual reality, right? So that's what this is. How do we not just teach TOB, but we bring them into an experience of TOB, or some concept in that, right? I'll tell you some ways that I did it today. We had demonstrations. I had a sponge with water, right? I created little pictures throughout the day, and hopefully that's what you're gonna remember the most, are the little pictures we created. I had you talk to each other, right? Interact with each other. That's another way. Okay, so what I've noticed, if I want them to have an experience, then I need to not only consider what I want to teach them under educate, like the concept I want them to get, but you already know this, especially if you're mothers, you know this already, because you've done this probably with your own children. But then I want to create an encounter, right? I want them to encounter each other. I want them to encounter Jesus. I want them to encounter the outside world, because we're called to like help them bring this to other people, you know? And then I want them to have something that they can practice living out and come back and tell me how it went, right? So like my girls, when we talk about gift of self, and I tell them, look for an opportunity to make a gift of yourself, what they have to do, they then have to capture whatever they're doing in a picture. They come back to class and they show the picture and they talk about their experience of giving themselves. And at the end of the year, I have the parents do the same thing and show them in a way. It creates an experience. And not only are they learning about gift of self, they're doing it, and then they're encountering each other's experiences, and they're learning from those experiences too, right? So in this idea of pedagogy, you can start anywhere in the circle. So if I think of a really good challenge to give my students, I want you to go home and this is what I want you to do, right? I could start there. And then I could go to, well, what did you learn? Oh, okay, and then who did you talk to, right? I can start anywhere in the circle. And it will constantly, if we're creating experiences, it will constantly keep going. They'll build on each other. The experiences will build on one another, right? Okay. So in your note packet, may I borrow not this one, but you have a little shortcut to the concepts back here. It looks like this. That's what we covered today. So I want you so it's called a presupposition, by the way, and what that means is it's something that we need to know to be able to understand what's next, right? And so therefore, what we're gonna find, you're gonna be sitting in Mass some days. My girls do this too. We have our Mass in our gym, once a month. And the priest will be giving the homily, and they're talking about something that is definitely a TOB concept, but I don't even know if he knows that. And the girls are looking for me, it's TOB, it's TOB. Yeah. And I'm okay. You'll start, right? You'll see it because it literally it's the foundation of our faith. And so don't be overwhelmed, right? Don't be overwhelmed. It's a lot of information. We did a lot today. But don't be overwhelmed, because what we need to do, I think, is ask the Holy Spirit to bring to our mind again what the students who are in front of us, what they need, right? So now you have heard it all. It's in your memory, and God can bring that back to mind for the people in front of you. And that's all you really need to worry about. Every year when I teach theology of the body I'm on my 6th year, it always looks a little different. Concepts are basically, I can do totally different things because I'm trying to pay attention to the need of the people in front of me, right? So don't be overwhelmed. Let the Holy Spirit, right, show you. The last thing I wanted to leave you with, because I love Lafayette so much and I want to come home someday, so y'all pray for that. I want to point us to, I think, the most important help here that we can access while we're here. Whenever we receive Jesus in the Eucharist, we believe that we're receiving his body, blood, soul, and divinity, his whole person, right? And St. Faustina, in her diary, she says this. She says, the angels envy us because when we receive the Eucharist, this is how she says it, his blood flows through our veins, right? The Eucharist is a one flesh union with Christ. It is the resurrection. It's the experience. We are united to Jesus in our souls, yes, but also in our bodies. Like he's letting us taste it right here, right now, right? In the Eucharist. And so I hope that in this year, we just had the year, the national bishops, right? The Eucharistic Congress and everything. So that, Jesus gives us that gift every time we receive them at Mass, right?